Welcome back. Up to this point, we've been pulling images from Docker Hub to launch containers. But in this video, we'll learn how to create our own images to launch our own containers. However, before we could start building and launching containers, we need to discuss the Dockerfile. A Dockerfile is a text document saved with the file name of Dockerfile that contains all the commands we would normally execute on the command line to assemble an image. And we'll be creating a Dockerfile to build an image which will include the Ubuntu OS and Python 3. But before we start building that Dockerfile, let's take a look at how we would build this container manually from an Ubuntu image in Docker Hub. So in our terminal, we see that I have no containers or images on my local machine. So let's start by pulling the 1604 tagged version of Ubuntu. Then let's run a container from this image, passing the IT flags to it so we have access to an interactive terminal, which we'll need to install Python. And now our Ubuntu server is up and running and we're logged in as root. Now in the terminal, we'll need to execute a couple commands to install Python. We'll start with apt-get update, then apt install Python 3. And let's just run a quick test to see if Python was successfully installed. So we're in the Python interactive shell and we can exit to get out. Now let's just echo out a simple Python script to a hello-python file. And we'll cat the file just to make sure it looks good. Then let's execute the script. And it looks good, so we can exit the container. And if we do a docker container ls-a, we see our container was terminated. Now, what if I wanted to spin up another container running Ubuntu with Python installed? Well, I'd have to go through these steps every time I need one of those containers. Enter the Dockerfile. As previously mentioned, the Dockerfile is a file named Dockerfile, which contains all the commands we would normally execute on the command line to assemble an image. So I'll create a new directory and cd into it, then create a new Dockerfile. Then I'll launch VS Code. Now, in the Dockerfile, I'll use the from command to tell Docker that I want to use Ubuntu 1604 as my base image. Then I'll add a run command for the apt-get update we executed in the interactive terminal. And finally, a run command to install Python 3, making sure to add the -y flag because we won't be able to interact with the script when Docker builds the image. I'll save the file and go back to the terminal. And there's our Docker file, which we can cat. And there's the contents. Now, what I want to do is execute the docker build command to build the image from the Docker file. I'll add a tag of my-ubuntu-image and then a dot to indicate that the Docker file's in the current directory, and hit enter. And if I do a docker image ls, now we see my Ubuntu image. So let's launch a container based on this image. And the container's running and we're logged in as root at the interactive terminal. I could cat etc issue and see the version of Ubuntu we're running. I can run Python 3 because it was part of our run script when we wrote the Docker file and it was executed when we built the image. And we could echo our print statement again to the hello-python file and execute it. And it works. In the next video, we'll look into Docker Compose and the sample Docker voting application provided by Docker.